Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. E.
And I am Bolton Mortimer, the Authenticator, and we have the Duality of Man.
Today, we're talking about the duality of man and drugs. We all know that drugs can have a very negative effect on the lives of everyone and also a negative effect on society. Personally, I am very much against drugs, like hard line. I do not believe that anybody should take them. Some people claim that they have some sort of medicinal effect. Personally, I feel like we could achieve those same effects through different means, and also I'm very hard line when it comes to you know punishment. I don't think that people should be overly punished. Like if you have like just some weed in your pocket, but I feel like drugs are have such a detrimental effect to people's lives and society that it's something that we should be taking very seriously. Dalton, where do you stand on the drugs issue?
This is going to be an interesting one because I am almost the direct inverse. I think most of the problems with drugs come from side effects of being overly draconian when it comes to drugs. My stance is legalize, tax, and regulate all drugs to a medical quality and purity standard, and then 90% of the problems with drugs will vanish. And the other half of the problems with drugs come from the draconian policies of the drug war, which is yet another one of those abstract wars that have no definable win states and therefore is a complete waste of everyone's fucking time. And considering that a great lion's share of the imprisoned in this country are nonviolent drug offenders, and given the nature of prison is basically criminal college, we could solve a lot of society's problems by treating drug addiction like a medical issue and not a criminal one, and also letting people in prison for nothing more than nonviolent drug offenses out of prison.
Well, I do agree that addiction should be treated like a disease. I mean, we used to lock up people who were dangerous to themselves in society that had diseases. Um, we used to forcibly commit them. I believe that we have since we stopped doing that in what the 80s.
Round about there, it the anti-asylum movement really got going in the 70s, and then there were books and movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and so on, and eventually the societal mood shifted to asylums are draconian and inhumane, and in particular things like lobotomization and the habit of keeping people with mental disorders sedated rather than actually hoping to treat them or help them have any meaningful quality of life. And I think we were on something resembling the right track with that. I think the big problem is, again, the drug war incentivized us to treat drugs like they were the problem in and of themselves, instead of the, as with prohibition, which we mentioned a couple weeks ago. Most of the problems with home brewed drugs, as with home brewed alcohol, is they're not kept to any medical quality or purity standards, or like cleanliness standards. However, 90% of the negative side effects of most street drugs come from the fact that they are produced in such informal settings. If we just legalized them all and regulated them to medical quality and purity standards and made them prescribable like every other freaking drug in the world, 90% of those problems would go away. And in formal laboratory settings, they've discovered that in many cases, the um, the drugs that big pharma is so gung ho about criminalizing are actually better for you in many ways than the big pharma alternatives.
Well,
Um,
big pharma is an entire problem in and of itself.
yeah, and I,
But
I put I put it to everyone that the drug war is not helping with this. In fact, in fact, a large part of the financial backing of the drug war is actually coming from big pharma, because they don't like the idea that you'd actually have permanent cures for a lot of these situations. They prefer the semi-poisonous solutions that only work only just well enough and keep you on the hook for the foreseeable life. Whereas in the case of, just as an example, they've done studies with psilocybin and DMT that suggest that one major mystical experience from psilocybin or DMT can do more as an antidepressant measure than years of taking over-the-counter antidepressants.
Well, then that's another thing about the whole. Did you see the recent study about antidepressants?
The fact that they're basically slowly poisoning everyone who takes them to death, yes.
Yeah, and there's no evidence that they actually cure depression at all.
No, they in fact basically just stall it so that the next low will be even lower, or the next manic episode will be even more manic.
Yeah, that's insane. Like big pharma is a big problem. But you mentioned alcohol because we did talk a bit about prohibition. Now, even though alcohol is legal and it's kept up to certain standards in terms of quality, it can still be an incredibly detrimental substance to people's lives. And I've known people who've had their whole lives destroyed because of alcohol, not just
Yeah,
the addiction, but also
I think
because of
we
the
all have. You know, the old
effects that
adage
it
of
does on
enjoy
the
responsibly is always still a thing.
yeah, like
But I see far too many of the negative side effects of prohibition in the modern day drug war to not think we'd still be better off if we just legalized and regulated everything to FDA or medical quality and purity standards and told people to drink or indulge responsibly with other drugs in the same way they do with everything else.
well, the thing is, like, it's impossible to really if they wanted to do a drug war, it would be really impossible to stem the flow of drugs with the American southern border as porous as it is, because that's where a lot of the drugs are coming from.
Yeah.
You have this big open border that is, just have people and illicit substances and illegal arms like flowing through it. But then you want to
Yeah.
wage a war on drugs, you're not actually stemming the inflow and you're punishing
Of
people who use it.
yeah, you're punishing the users who, for the most part, really just want to do the same thing that your average drinker does. You know, have a few on a Saturday or a Sunday and chill or whatever. And in most cases, that's what most drug users end up using those drugs for. Is, you know, I'm in my off hours in my own time. I'd like to tweak my consciousness in this particular way or that particular way. And again, in a lot of cases, especially with psychedelics, there are, albeit minimal, because the parameters of having to study this stuff is very, very strict because it is largely illegal. But most of the substantive studies that have been done on psychedelics suggest that they have a lot of benefits, that we previously didn't know that they had. Although, you know, the cultures that we got these drugs from sort of implied that, but you know, never let it be said that science would ever take people's word for it when they could just as easily reinvent the wheel. But the other thing about, and relating back to your point about the various cartels and the drug lords and so on, that's another large amount of money that flows into the drug war and drug policy coffers. Ironically enough, part of it comes from big pharma, and the other part of it comes from drug barons, because they know, as per with the mafia and prohibition, the very second we knock off this drug war bullshit and start treating, you know, other drugs like we treat every other drug substance, you know, the kind that you get from big pharma, they are basically out of their business model. I mean, just look at the hit that cartels took when weed started getting selectively legalized and or decriminalized. Imagine a similar sized chunk being taken out of the cartels every time we legalize or regulate a new drug along with it.
Yeah, but recently drugs have been getting extremely more dangerous and volatile. I believe the latest one that everybody's talking about, fentanyl. It's extremely dangerous and can kill you with an extremely small amount, and
Yeah,
it's very
and the
easily mixed into to other things.
yeah, cocaine and heroin specifically. But the funny thing is, fentanyl actually was refined by Big Pharma first, and only after some less than scrupulous pharmacists and nurses allowed for their supply of fentanyl to wind up on the street cut with cocaine and heroin, did it become a problem. So once again, I have to ask, if this is going to happen even under Big Pharma's watch, then couldn't we just simplify the situation by just stop treating it like it's the worst thing in the world? If we
I don't
if
know.
we,
I've
if we
seen
Go ahead.
I've seen the effects of drugs, and look, I know that it's going to be a problem that cannot be entirely stopped, but it's something that I believe that we should stop as much as that we can.
And I think the best way to do that, as with weed, was a large part of the reason why people get so heavily addicted to things is because there's a level of edge to them. But the second that black market dissolves into a white market, a lot of the edge goes away, and then it just becomes a normal part of a normal part of the options that people have, much as with smoking and much as with drinking. I'm not really a fan of smoking, but I'm not going to ban smoking because, in my experience, authoritarian draconian prohibitions never work and, in fact, incentivize the problem. Whereas, not always, but often, when you take a more libertarian approach and just let people be, um, an equilibrium of some kind will be established just by virtue of it being a normal thing. And it's funny because in England in particular in the 1800s, many of the what we would now refer to as hard substances, heroin, hashish, opium, and so on, were um, legal and available for those with the means to procure them, because of course these were expensive things one way or the other. Um, and it wasn't until the passage of the first, I believe, the un uh, undesirable drugs act or something along those lines was passed, that it became this fraught um, black market. And I have to wonder, maybe I'm very hesitant to use the phrase maybe the Victorians had something right that we have wrong, but just this once, maybe the Victorians had something right that we have wrong. Just with this one.
Well, the thing is, you got to think, why was that law passed in the first place? Almost certainly because a lot of people were being gripped by addiction, and almost certainly, since it was so expensive, people of
Well,
affluence
it
and
actually had more to do with the rise of the temperance movement and people's um essentially what amounted to moral prudishness, the same impulse that led to um alcohol being banned over here led to a lot of those things being banned over there. And in fact, even absinthe was demonized for a long while. And the main reason absinthe was demonized was not because absinthe was this dangerous uh, alcohol. It was because absinthe was becoming more popular among artists and creative thinkers at the time, and the gin and whiskey producers didn't like it. There was also, much in the same way as with our drug war over here, is very often targeted disproportionately at people in poor communities. There was also a classist thing over there. For example, in Britain, when Prohibition happened, um, gin was illegal and whiskey was still legal because um, whiskey was the drink that was more popular among the upper classes, and gin was more popular among the lower classes. So part of it is moral prudishness. The other part is just good old fashioned. We can't let the pores enjoy something we can't enjoy. Grr.
Well, my feelings regarding that are these substances have been illegal for a long time now. People know that they're illegal. If you knowingly engage in these substances and then you get like thrown in jail and arrested, my sympathy starts wearing very thin. Now, I believe that the punishment doesn't always fit the crime. I believe that there are certain sentences where, if they're punished far too harshly for like certain drug offenses, but it's at the end of the day, it was still something that everybody knows is illegal and that you chose to engage in anyway. If
Okay, but
you
I'm.
if you
Go ahead.
wanted
Sorry.
something to be legal, you could advocate for it within the bounds of the law, but also not be breaking the law by engaging in this. Um,
Yeah, but my problem with that line of argumentation is that's a little bit like saying let he who is without a pirated movie or TV show cast the first stone, in the sense of laws exist to maintain civil order and to crack down on ethical violations. And if a given law is more about moral prudishness and censoriousness than it is about civil order or um, anything that could reasonably be defined as an ethical violation, then I see no reason why that law should even be on the books to begin with. It's kind of like when Count Dankula was convicted of gross offense for creating the Nazi pug video. There were actually some people in the news media who were going, "Well, he knew it was illegal. Why did he engage with it if he knew it was illegal to begin
well,
with?"
here's the thing with the Count Dankula thing. Like, you could argue that that law is up to very wide interpretation. Like, some people might not view it as grossly offensive. Some people may. Like, you don't know how someone is going to interpret that video as a joke. However, with this, like, it's a very clear cut. These substances are illegal, and I would say that it is important for the maintaining of social order, because I've seen people interact with people on drugs, and shit can get very disorderly. When I was in college, somebody on my floor, went wild on drugs, and it like he almost freaking attacked me.
How much of that though is the drug's fault, and how much of that is the fact that he got it on the black market and it was probably cut with a bunch of dangerous shit's fault? That's my problem. There are variables in this situation that we can eliminate. We can eliminate the draconian laws that enable the black market to begin with. We can eliminate the fact that it's cut with all sorts of dangerous shit, and we can eliminate the edgy stigma that leads people to try it anyway, to some degree. But we can't eliminate the fact that some people may need these drugs, and some people may find that they're the only drugs that work. And I'm sorry, but when the law becomes overly burdensome or overly bureaucratic or overly censorious, maybe it's the freedom loving American in me, but when the tea tax is too high, we throw it in the harbor kind of impulse. And when the drug laws make no fucking sense, then you know they're to be avoided in the same way as the internet piracy laws. Again, let he who is without the pirated copy of any given movie or show ever cast the first stone towards the nonviolent drug offenders. And I do stress nonviolent because, of course, the second you engage in violence under these substances, then it's in the same relative ballpark as somebody who drives drunk. You don't get to use the excuse, I didn't know I was going drink driving because I was drunk at the time. Well, in the same way, if you do violent shit while you're on drugs, then it's not the drug that we blame, it's the violent part. You know, you are accountable for other crimes you may commit while on these substances, but the substances themselves are not a crime. Just like drinking, when you're of a given legal drinking age, is not a crime. But if your drinking causes someone to be in a car wreck or, God forbid, manslaughter or lose their life or something, then we blame you for the actual immoral action you did wrong. I refuse to believe that the drug itself, in imbibing the drug, is an immoral action for the same reason that I still to this day laugh at the very concept of prohibition. It has never worked. It's never going to work. And in general, law is there to maintain order. It is not there for moral grandstanding and moral puritanism. End of, in my opinion, anyway.
See, in I understand what you're saying in regards of comparing drugs to alcohol, but I'm of the opinion that there should be some limits on certain alcohols. Like there are like certain things, like say grain alcohols. I feel that like that should not be um on
Yeah,
the market.
like
Like it's
moonshining and bathtub
like
gins and that sort of thing.
imbibing in a beer or like a cocktail is like perfectly fine, but like there are some like strengths of alcohol out there that are just people should not be consuming that. And this is my and I hold the same opinion with drugs. Like you remember the reading of the MK Ultra report where some guy imbibed LSD, albeit unknowingly, but when he was on LSD, he was seeing demons everywhere, and that can be
Yeah,
extremely dangerous.
but again, I put most of the impetus on the people who dosed him unknowingly and unethically. I again, in the same way that if you got somebody drunk without them realizing it, you would be an asshole and you would be somewhat accountable for any crazy shit they did while on that substance. But we
Well, I
don't
agree, but
blame the
my concern
booze.
is still the effect that it had on him and the things that he was seeing because of it.
Yeah, but there's a difference between unknowingly engaging with a substance, in public versus in the privacy of your own home, choosing knowingly to engage with these substances.
The thing is, even if he engaged with it willingly, even if he was in the privacy of his own home, it could still have an effect on him to where he is harming himself, even if he's not a danger to the general public. And we
I
often stop people
mean,
from doing things that hurt themselves.
it see, I'm not sure to what extent I mean, there's a case for that, but in most cases, that's where you get the nanny state going, and I don't think it's anyone else's business whether a person harms themselves as long as it's within the bounds of reasonableness. Like as annoying as it is when someone drinks themselves into a coma, you know, it's a terrible bureaucratic oversight to try and go. We will be the regulators of how much alcohol you will consume, young man, and so on, and even to some extent assisted suicide. I think, especially in medical situations, if someone is in so much pain that they would literally rather die than continue living in that much pain, I don't consider physician assisted suicide to be a wrong in that case, as long as the person is cognizant of the choice they're making.
Well,
I don't think it. I'm staunchly libertarian on this point. While I can make all the philosophical arguments I want as to why you shouldn't harm yourself, and I would definitely see a world, would rather see a world in which fewer people did harm themselves. You are the owner of yourself, so if you choose to harm yourself, it's very similar to the choice of damaging your own property. Like if you buy a flag just to burn it, then I may have philosophical objections to that, but you bought it with your own money and your own free will and are capable of doing with it what you want. I think your body and your life should, to some extent, be the same way as long as there's no criminal malfeasance involved. Um,
the thing is, burning a flag, you aren't even harming yourself. However, you know, when you are drinking yourself to death or doing drugs to the point where you're harming yourself, um, I do feel that we as a society, like just as one human being to another, have certain responsibilities to, help
I
that person. Like,
I think
no, like I
I think our responsibilities begin and end at in making sure the person is making an informed choice. We
well,
have
that's
the
the thing.
ability we have the
If
ability to make counter arguments. We have the ability to for example, try and dissuade them from trying it in the first place. But when someone has made that informed choice, I don't think it's anyone's responsibility but the person who's doing it to do that.
Well,
We can
well,
all
here's the thing. My
begrudge the loss, but we don't ha- we shouldn't have the moral impetus to prevent it. I don't think.
the thing is, like people who often do this, it's not them saying like, "Yes, I acknowledge all the risk behind this, and I'm still making the confident and logical choice to drink myself to death." Usually, there's some underlying problem that they're trying to, you know, put a
Yeah,
patch
there's a
over with drugs and
psychological problem,
alcohol,
what have you,
and
but
it's not something that like they would do if they didn't like have this problem. So, wouldn't
yeah,
the correct thing
the
to be
correct
to
answer would often be to try and address the underlying problem. But as we all know, modern day psychology is a shit show. So, we can't sit here and hope for a utopian future where everyone will one day just choose not to engage with this. Freedom includes the freedom to make the wrong choice sometimes, and as long as that wrong choice is only impacting the person who made it, I I'm staunchly libertarian on this. If you want to harm yourself, I can make arguments as to why that's a stupid idea. I can present various alternatives, but at the end of the day, your free will includes the ability to do things that I would consider wrong. Because the very second we go into the very second we go into the area where your freedom of the freedom of your will doesn't include things that I define as wrong, then we wind up in the 1984 superstate scenario where it's all the various Karens and or Helen Lovejoys going, "Won't somebody please think of my moral standards?" And then away we go into authoritarianville. I think it's a shitty situation, but between the two shitty situations, one in which no one is ever allowed to harm themselves even by accident, or one in which people are allowed to harm themselves, but at least it's their choice, I'm going with option two every time.
well, it's I mean, I was going to go on one point, but there's another point I want to talk about. You know, these things, rarely are ever self-contained. Like, say you have someone who's addicted to say alcohol or drugs, they are not usually a stable individual, and they're not usually going to be able to function in normal society. It's going to be very difficult for them to maintain a certain standard of living and even hold out a job if their addiction gets the grips of them too much. And when they lose, like say, a source of income, but they're still struck with the addiction, where are they going to go? They're going to turn to crime.
I think that's a lot less likely if it's in a white market as opposed to a black market, because
Well, the thing is, alcohol is in a white market. People still become addicted to it. They still have difficulty holding on a job, and sometimes they still resort to crime in order to feed their
yeah,
habit.
but comparing the rates of that same occurrence during prohibition to the occurrences now, it's still better to have it be in a white market than in a black one, because in a black market they're already being forced to engage with the criminal element, whereas in a white market, whatever criminal actions they get up to are their own, and we can address the actual criminal actions, but we can't address the things that make that we can't address the things that put them there for exactly the same reason as the Jack Thompson and Anita Sarkeesians of the world in their ideal world would ban video games, or would at least very heavily censor or modify video games to prevent all sorts of crimes that they associate with video games. But the correct answer is you aim your legal system and your criminal system at the actual uh, malicious actions. You don't aim it at the tangential cause of those things. We blame we charge the drunk driver who hits a child in the road with manslaughter and with reckless driving. We don't prevent them from ever buying alcohol again.
You know, usually whatever somebody does is they're forced into a like say they commit manslaughter while under intoxication. They're usually forced into some sort of rehabilitation program.
And
That
that's a possible option, but we don't. But at the end of the day, it's still only a rehabilitation program, because otherwise you wind up in the situation where it's like, okay, we're just literally going to lobotomize the part of their brain that's addicted to this, and then yeah, you get into the now you've committed a humanitarian crime to prevent another humanitarian crime situation.
well, I don't think that we're ever going to resort back to something like lobotomies.
No, but I I would say we know that there's an obvious that's an obvious direction we'd be moving in if we tried to be more restrictive. So in general, I I see things as the general answer to most questions is offer as clean and as clean and as regulated access to this as we can, and then whatever errors that occur are going to be the fault of the people who do them, not the fault of the thing that quote unquote made them do it.
Now, I would be more than open for lessening the harshness of drug sentences. You know, making it more about people getting help and
Yeah. And I think 9 times out of 10, community service is probably enough for nonviolent drug offenders.
yeah
Violent
and
drug offenders are a different issue entirely, and drug kingpins are a different issue entirely. But
yeah no, like
nonviolent drug offenders, especially like teenagers or young 20 somethings, which is most of the nonviolent drug offenders, probably could be slapped on the wrist with rehab and community service, and could call it good in most cases. Obviously, not all, because we live in a we live in a world that's hoping for the best of all possible worlds, not the perfect world. But you know,
yeah, I feel
in,
like if it's going to
in
be
general.
community service, it should be something physical. Like I'm not talking putting them into like something like hard labor camp, but just I feel like when you're trying to issue out a punishment, like a punishment where they actually have to physically do something rather than like
Yeah,
say reading to the elderly is would be a much better
yeah. The picking
future
up
mechanism.
litter, the retiling of roofs, or something like
Cleaning
that.
up
Yeah,
graffiti.
yeah.
But
Some,
I feel like
something.
that would be good. But I still wouldn't support legalization. And if we were to do something like that, we would absolutely have to get a handle on the southern border to stem the inflow.
Well, a large part of the reason why we don't get a handle on the southern border is because, sadly enough, a lot of money comes through the political coffers through the drug kingpins and the like Colombian warlords and so on. So I would think that legalizing, or at least heavily decriminalizing, a lot of these drugs, as it did with pot and as it did with booze in relation to the mafia, heavily decriminalizing or legalizing the majority of drugs would cripple a lot of these cartels, and would therefore make it easier to um, get the political will to do something about these. Because as long
But
as the drug kingpins are making oodles of money, they can bribe the less than scrupulous politicians, which is most of them, to be incompetent, and then whoops, we go another decade without the border being abreast. Who knew?
but to your own point, if cartels and drug lords are funneling monies to politicians, couldn't they just do that to make sure that the substances do not get legalized?
I mean, to some degree, but this is why this is my answer to this problem, because if we're not even allowed to address the point of decriminalization and legalization, then this will never ever change and will only get worse. Whereas if the majority of the political will is behind criminalization and delegalization, uh, or decriminalization, just like it was with prohibition, it doesn't. At some point, it's gonna stop mattering how much money is being funneled to the the politicians, just like in the old days, there was a lot of money coming to politicians through the mafia to keep booze illegal for the purposes of continuing bootlegging. But eventually, it also fell so heavily out of fashion that it was no longer sustainable, even through all the chicanery.
With the mafia, I feel like the violence that was caused by it was also a big major part of why prohibition was overturned. And there is certainly a lot of violence regarding.
I was about to say, are we really going to the there's less violence caused by drug war than there is by prohibition? Well, because
No, I'm not. I'm just saying that the violence would also be a major part about why it was overturned, and there is a lot of violence um, regarding the drug industry. But I don't think that we are. I don't think we're at the same point as we were in prohibition. I'm not saying it's not as bad. I'm just saying like this violence.
I mean maybe, but this is why this is my stance. I'm not expecting everyone to fall in line with my particular way of doing things because that would be stupid. But you know, all the other alternatives seem worse to me, so I'm going to continue to say what I consider to be the most sane option is, and hopefully at some point in the not too distant future, someone will listen. Also worth noting, how many um how many members of certain political activist groups do you think were on drugs while they were in the middle of rioting? Because I don't know the exact numbers, but I would hazard a guess that quite a lot of those rich uh, waspish college kids who engaged in things like Antifa, BLM, BAM, and so on. I'm betting there's quite a lot of drugs involved because looking, for example, at the case of Godzi Kozo's Black Hammer, we know for a fact that a lot of them were on drugs when they were doing shit. So, you know, call me crazy, but somehow I don't suspect that Yvette Falarka or Chanta Driver is going to be all that anti-drug, especially in freaking Portland, relating to all the waspish college kids.
Well, those demographics are a shit show for an entire variety of reasons.
I mean, yeah, that we could spin entire like 10 entire episodes. Like someday we might actually have to do Men and Antifa just to address that whole elephant in the room. I'm just saying I don't even think that there's such a great divide between the political violence that we see in this day and age and the drug violence that we see in this day and age, especially considering that, in particular, with the case of BLM, a lot of the um, a lot of the cannon fodder that groups like BLM love to use come from inner cities, which tend to be lousy with these sorts of gang activities, which would probably go away if these drugs were in a white market, which is another reason why they might be taking their sweet time getting us there. Because if we make the inner city poor kids actually happy and sustainable in their lives, then they're not easily turned into political capital for us.
Well, here's the things: people in those communities, and I know I'm from one of them, like they have opportunities, but often it's a lot easier to do like gangs
Yeah,
and drugs because the money flows a lot quicker when you go down that road. And you know, say if you choose the more difficult but more legal and sustainable road, like you'll be a lot safer, but like the money
it'll take
won't.
longer and be more difficult. Therefore, let's just go the quick and nasty and likely to crash and burn, but at least it'll be fun along the way route. Again, the Godzi Kozo defense, basically. Oh,
I feel like if we were to really educate people about the danger and the you know the problems of engaging in a criminal lifestyle and how it can negatively impact you, your friends, family,
your
children if they have
community, etc., so on and so forth. Yeah.
yeah. But regarding your other point, you said that you were picking the option of legalizing drugs because you didn't think the other options would work. Personally, I believe that they could work. The problem is, like, we're only doing them half-assed.
Well, there's that, but there's also the fact of I guess for me it's a what kind of future do I want? Do I want a future where we're cracking down on things and being draconian and authoritarian, or do I want a future where we learned our lesson and we learned to sort of ease off the controls more? And in my experience, most often the moralistic authoritarian approach goes horribly wrong, backfires horribly, and results in everyone being miserable. Whereas the libertarian approach may be more difficult in the long run, but is also more rewarding and actually, if it could be said that there's a meaningful, progression of history, which, we all know I hate because Hegel was a fucking idiot and the whole progression of history thing is bollocks largely. But just like um, during the Civil War, there was a disagreement of, if we free the slaves, then we'll have economic difficulties for the foreseeable future, but at least we'll be living in a more humane existence. I think generally the more libertarian, more hands off approach tends to be the more fruitful and rewarding one, and is a future that I would find more worthwhile of getting to rather than the uh, censorious draconian one. Because the draconian censorious option is always an option, but on balance, my answer remains fuck and no to every draconian authoritarian option.
Like, I'm not, like, you know me, I don't want to go like full iron fist on society, like with with my proposed idea, but I still feel like there's there like we just can't have a fully open society, because a fully open society, in my opinion, will descend into chaos. There has to be some lines somewhere, some rules,
Yeah, but
and
I think the lines are basically organic and emergent. Just like everyone and their mother, when weed was being legalized or at least decriminalized, was going, if you legalize weed, then it will be chaos in the streets and people will get in car wrecks because they got high and yada yada yada. And then, the dispensaries opened and, the world continued spinning and people found an organic equilibrium. And in most cases, I generally find that when you take the more libertarian approach, the restrictions will arise, but they will arise organically, emergent from people's own personal choices, and eventually people will just treat it like a normal thing, and they'll cease to be this aura of appeal around it. Whereas if you go the other route, then everyone is miserable and everything is utterly out of control and chaotic, because when you suppress human nature, it inevitably ends up backfiring horribly, and it ends up taking twice as long as it would have if we had just done the smart and humane approach of leave everyone the fuck alone and let them find their own boundaries.
see, you say that if we legalize it, it might lose some of its appeal. I don't think so, because alcohol's been legal for forever, and like it's still with a lot of appeal, especially when
Yeah, but
people
when
are
you
younger.
compare when you compare the appeal of it now versus the appeal of it during Prohibition, it was a lot worse during Prohibition, and the sources of it were also a lot worse during Prohibition, because when you have to do things in a black market, the consequences of having to um, do so in a secretive, non-humane environment always end up being horrible. Whereas now, yes, you have people who occasionally, they get into the booze before they're of legal drinking age, and we've all been there. We've all known people who even at like the age of like 15 or 16 are already well accustomed to drinking. But 9 times out of 10, most of those people who start drinking at age 15 or 16 get whatever they need to get out of their system, and eventually find a decent equilibrium. There is that 1 out of 10 person who will go completely hog wild and go off the reservation. But the thing is, they would have probably gone off the reservation like that anyway if it were a prohibition style situation. It's worse because at least in a situation where alcohol is legal, they can go and get help. There's AA, there's all sorts of things. Whereas when it's under a black market, there's a stigma even around indulging in it to begin with. So not only are you a bad, you're a terrible person with terrible self-control for engaging in this, but you're also extra double immoral because you did an illegal thing.
I like I said, I feel like that we should focus on getting such people help. Uh, but in my response, shit, I just had an idea and it fell out of my head.
Take your time.
Hold on, let me try and get it back. Oh yeah, here it is. Uh, you know, with alcohol, yeah, people were moonshining, but it's like it's still basically the same. You're fermenting something, and you're putting it into alcohol and drinking it. However, like new types of drugs are cropping up all the time, and oftentimes in ways we can't predict. I mean, do you remember bath salts? Who the hell would have seen that coming?
Yeah, that one was out of nowhere. But honestly, again, I wonder if these substances were legalized and regulated, like in a similar way that we do weed or in a similar way that we do booze, would there be that drive for the next biggest high? Because the thing is, and this is the other little canard here, a lot of the illegal substances are chemically almost indistinguishable from a lot of the legal substances. For example, um, if you are a person that has ADD or ADHD, and I know this because I had a friend in college who had ADD and ADHD, and he always used to giggle that his ADD meds was an amphetamine that was almost chemically indistinguishable from meth. But because it was big pharma, it was okay. Whereas if he had,
Wait,
if,
are you serious?
yeah,
Because I was on those meds in junior high school.
yeah. So
That
it,
explains
it
why I felt so fucking weird.
yeah, huh? You were basically on like one chemical peptide removed meth. Um, so I have to once again point out that if it weren't for big pharma and it weren't for the cartels, you literally probably couldn't distinguish between the legal variations of these drugs and the illegal variations of these drugs. For example, morphine and heroin are very, very chemically similar as well. Um,
Well, morphine is also dangerous because people get addicted to that as well.
Yes, and that is another factor of this. Given that we know that they get addicted even to the allegedly safe for you versions. People get addicted to morphine, people get addicted to opioids, and so on and so forth. You know, is it really substantively all that more different than getting addicted to various illicit drugs, other than again the quality and purity standards and the existing in a black market part? And we should definitely be addressing the opioid crisis. Don't get me wrong, and that's another aspect of men and drugs that we should talk about the dangers of all of the drugs that are perfectly legal and perfectly normal according to the powers that be, that
Yeah,
also
we
fuck
touched on that
people
a bit
over
last
horribly.
time
Yeah.
with no wait, that wasn't yeah, we touched a bit on that with men in the government, how the pharmaceutical companies lied about the safety of opioids. But you know, if we already have all these things that are legal and people are still getting addicted to them and going through, very bad symptoms while they're supposed to be taking something that helps them. My question is, why would we then introduce more things that would just complicate the situation, especially if they're legal and
Because
they're able to get them themselves? And um, here's another thing: like, you say that these drugs are very similar to the things that people are giving to treat things like ADHD, but as somebody who is on that, I have to question: are those things even really helping?
I mean, no, but here's the other niggling little detail. And again, according to the few studies that we do have on this, a lot of the a lot of the more organic versions of these drugs are better for you than the laboratory synthesized versions. Again, psychedelics are a far better alternative to any on the market antidepressants. There are cases where if you just chew the leaves of the coca plant, the plant that we get cocaine from, it's actually a better and more sustainable stimulant even than coffee. So part of me, and maybe this is me getting all my tinfoil hat, but part of me wonders if some of these drugs aren't illegal because someone at Big Pharma has figured out that a lot of them are better and more sustainable for people in the long run than the Big Pharma alternatives, and they want to prevent these things from being legalized because they know that they can make more money off of a person who needs a pill every 42 hours than someone who would need the equivalent of that pill once and then never need it again. It's very similar to the thing with government programs. The old phrase of "there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program." The reason why, in a lot of cases, is because the longer they can sustain the problem rather than actually fixing it, the more you need the government, and therefore the more power they can accrue from you. Whereas if they actually solve the issue, they would be able to put their feet up, crack a cold one, and pat themselves on the back for a job well done, and say you won't be needing us anymore. So the same thing happened with the FBI and so on. They were set up specifically to crack down on the mafia, and then the mafia was cracked down upon, and when the FBI just went, I'm sure there are things you will need us for later. Don't disband the FBI, even though our mandate for existing has expired. I'm sure you'll be needing us for stuff later, and I'm wondering how much of the approach to illegalizing certain drugs is more about big pharma going, well, we could give them something that would solve this problem in an instant, or at least in a few hours, and they would only have to take it once. Or we can give them a pill that will barely even do half of the shit that the alternative would do, but will have them on it for the rest of their lives and never ever cease having a source of revenue from them forevermore. And if
All
they
right,
get addicted, so much the better, because then we can offer the addiction eliminating drugs.
all right. Say these things are legalized, which again I don't believe that they should, but let's say that your plan goes through and they are legalized and held to some certain standard and quality and purity. But the thing is, if these drugs are legalized, one of the things that causes people to OD is the mixing of different drugs together. And if they are, being able to be more widely obtained, what's to stop people from, say, getting some heroin, getting some methamphetamines, and taking them both at the same time?
Because in a hypothetical situation where they've been legalized and regulated, one of the things we would have more knowledge of is the ability to print the side effects on them like we do all the other drugs. And what's more, they can do that just as well with all of the extant things. And again, given that some of these have more permanent, lasting positive effects than the alternatives, maybe, let's say for example you are a chronically debilitatingly depressed person, and you go to opioids or whatever you happen to go to get high enough that you can forget about it for a little while. And eventually you end up chasing the dragon and chasing the dragon and chasing the dragon, bigger and bigger doses, and you die. Or one hypothetical psilocybin pill, you take it once. Oh shit, my uh, neurochemistry is altered beneficially in a mostly permanent sense, and I only have to do this 2 or 3 more times before I'm cured of my depression. Full stop, and then done. The one of the reasons why people end up mixing and matching drugs is because the drugs they have access to aren't working like they're supposed to.
Well, the thing is, people often build up drug tolerances when they keep engaging with a substance.
Yeah,
You don't get, like, say, drunk as fast or high as fast,
yeah,
or the high is not as high.
right. And that's true with everything, though. more more options, in my opinion, will probably result in people finding a drug that works better for them in a lot of cases. Not all cases, but again, we're hoping for a better world than the world in which we currently find ourselves, not a perfect one. So, you know, unfortunately, while it would be nice if we could just snap our fingers and we could get just enough of everything that everyone was happy, and but not enough to make everyone OD or become dangerous or what have you. Unfortunately, we don't have that power, and even if we did, we would probably misuse it. So, you know, one way or the other, we're going to have to deal with some problems. The question is, which of these problems are you willing to prioritize? And frankly, I'm more willing to prioritize the occasional people who will fuck up while everyone else gets a better and more lasting quality of life. Big Pharma gets screwed over, the drug cartels get screwed over, the bureaucratic apparatus of the drug war gets screwed over, and people who don't have the resources that they might need now, because Big Pharma is screwing them, might obtain those resources if we legalized, tax, and regulated everything at our disposal rather than just selectively, oh, the things that big pharma say are okay, quote unquote. You know,
But the thing is, like, you mentioned repeatedly about people who want to take um, you know things like psilocybin because they could be very beneficial to them in the ways that our current uh, drugs are not. And I'm all for helping people, but what I'm concerned about primarily is the people who go to take drugs just to chase that high. They don't not suffering from any problem. They just want to experience that thrill that comes
yeah,
from
but the thing is, most of the time, 9 times out of 10, someone can engage with that in their free time, just like they can engage with booze or weed or what have you, and they can maintain a level of self control. Yes, there's that 1 in 10 that becomes a problem, but there are people with addictive personalities who become addicted to literally anything and everything. There are people who get that addicted to sugar, vis-a-vis the obesity epidemic, but we don't, you know, stymie people's sugar intake. Maybe, there's an argument to be made for maybe we should, but I think in
as
general we're
someone who
better
quit
off leaning
sugar.
in towards
I
the
would be
let
in
people
full.
figure it out for themselves approach.
I'm someone who quit sugar, so I there's somebody who feels a lot better off of it, especially with high fructose corn syrup not flowing through my system anymore.
Yeah. I, and I mean, there are benefits to getting rid. That's one of the reasons I made the sugar example, because the thing is, in the same way that coca leaves are perfectly justifiable and are a better stimulant even than coffee, and yet, refining it into the powdery form of cocaine is often horrible. In the same way, we took sugar cane or sugar beets, depending on the sorts of sugar, and we refined that into a powder. And surprise, fucking surprise, sugar is basically dietary cocaine. And And what's more is the FDA and other bureaucracies have known that sugar is basically dietary cocaine for decades, and yet they created a false panic about carbohydrates instead because they didn't want to lose that sweet sugar money, pun very much intended.
Yeah, things like that. Like it's a very much thing where people will tell you to trust the experts. You know what they're talking about. Meanwhile, they're bought and paid for.
And or have ideological reasons for warping the data beyond all reason rather than actually following what the data actually would imply if it was rendered properly. Because no matter how grand an expert is in their expertise, number one, the expertise itself can be wrong vis-a-vis, back in the old days we used to believe in the four humors theory of disease, and then in the intermediary time we believed in the nervous excitation theory of disease, and the people who proposed the germ theory of disease were laughed at originally, and so on and so forth. So there, and in physics, for example, for many centuries, Newton was the last word on physics, and then Einstein showed up, and everyone thought Einstein was crazy, but he had the numbers, so eventually we finally came around. And the same thing is coming around now with quantum theory and string theory. Like sometimes the paradigm itself is wrong and needs to be updated, you know, again, I gave several examples, and sometimes it's human error, and sometimes, probably most often, it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. So, as per usual, the bog standard Socratic answer is fuck authority, focus on substance. If the person is actually capable of and willing to make an argument, then they should be obliged to make the argument because it's not the person and it's not the office and it's not the paradigm that gives something authority. It's actually being like rational and substantive that gives something authority because authority is nothing in a sane world but a byproduct of knowing what the fuck you're talking about. In an insane world, authority becomes more important than substance, and then we wind up in, you know, experts as aristocrats or bureaucrats, kind of like we have now. Why? It's why
You know,
Socrates' main logical um, innovation was walking up to people who claimed to have knowledge and authority on a given topic and asking them very simple logical questions, usually showing them up to be no such goddamn thing. And it's funny that now in this day and age, we've wound up in a situation where if you Socratically question the powers that be get very, very morally front at you rather than actually addressing the argument. Because I am the valid people and you are the invalid people, therefore you should just heed what I tell you. What do you mean I should actually have to know what I'm talking about and defend my argument?
well, I do believe that a lot of authority is, a lot of faith in authority is unwarranted nowadays. Like, th- there are still like certain people who like you you would trust to get information from,
Yeah,
and
but that's because very often those very same people aren't really focused on authority for authority's sake. They're focused on if I know what I'm talking about, then I therefore have authority. But
well,
very often it goes the other way around. I have authority, therefore I must by default know what I'm talking about, which
well,
is wrong.
well, my view of the situation is that, like, say you have like these walls that exist. Like, say you're living in a town, and then you walk out to town, and all of a sudden there's a wall there. Now, you don't know why the wall exists. You don't know, like the people that put the wall up, but it's there, and you want to tear the wall down because you feel the wall is restrictive, not realizing that because that after you tear the wall down, you are then reintroducing the problem the wall was erected to prevent.
Okay, but the problem with that analogy is it's incumbent upon the people who maintain the wall to actually know why the fuck the wall is there. And if they don't know why the wall is there any longer, then the person who wants to tear down the wall is perfectly justified in wanting to tear down the wall.
But
My answer,
even if tearing down the wall reintroduces the problem the wall was erected to prevent,
Well, yes, if no one inside the Citadel can explain to you why the wall is fucking there, then someone has fucked up and they need to be reminded of why the wall is there. Or, and here's the other thing, sometimes problems that once existed either change or the way we can address them also change. So sometimes traditions and authority becomes a relic of a it essentially becomes the sigil, like the appendix. It was at one time the best answer we had, but we have better answers now, so there's no fucking need. For example, if um, the wall was kept out, was put up to prevent wolves from attacking, and wolves go extinct, then the wall is no longer necessary. Or if we develop better guns that are capable of shooting the wolves so that we can actually deal with them on a case by case basis, the wall is no longer necessary. And that does happen sometimes. This is my problem with tradition for tradition's sake or authority for authority's sake is number one, sometimes the answer that the authority or the tradition came up with is not a this is the one correct answer. It's a this was the good enough answer at the time. And the problem with good enough answers is sometimes answers need to be improved. Sometimes they become outdated. Sometimes variables change and the situation needs to be readdressed. So it is always incumbent upon those who exercise authority to understand why they are exercising it. And if someone can make a reasonable counter argument to that argument, you don't get to go, well, I'm right because I have, tradition and authority on my side. Because sometimes, as with Socrates, tradition and authority become basically a hollow shell where once there was a point, but there is no longer, or maybe the point was only half baked to begin with, and somebody came up with a better answer.
My question for you is, do you believe that the societal conditions, the paradigm, if you will, have shifted enough to where if we were to, legalize drugs and say open them up to the wider public, that it would not cause severe issues?
I think there's certainly a case for that. Like I said, in Britain in the 1800s, they seemed to be getting along relatively fine. Before the dangerous drugs and substances, and I'm blanking on the name of the act, but before they introduced their first drug act, it seemed that way with prohibition. It seemed that way with weed. It's seeming that way now, even with psychedelics, because people are coming slowly around to the idea of decriminalizing or legalizing psychedelics, and yay. Um, and in a lot of cases, there were exceptions to these rules that existed for a long time. For example, salvia used to be legal um, a legal uh, psychedelic in the 90s, and in a lot of places it still is legal, but in some states, because the powers that be happened to be of the more prudish, we need to ban everything variety, they banned salvia, even though nothing substantively has changed. It's just one person had a Helen Lovejoy reaction when they shouldn't have, and now it's a law basically subsuming on inertia.
Well, my argument would be that I don't believe that human beings have changed enough to be able to deal with these, to be able to deal with the effects of drugs. But we have a comment from Ed Brewer. All drugs, yes, severe issues. Some drugs, nah, it'll be fine.
And that is an option. There is the sort of boiling the frog option, slowly decriminalize or slowly legalize drug after drug after drug, and then figure out which ones it works with and which ones it doesn't work with. But in general, I advocate for more decriminalization and more legalization than we have now rather than less, because that seems to usually be something approaching the correct answer, or at least leaves the option open for the correct answer, whereas the alternative is very much usually circular, self-fulfilling, moralistic, and makes everyone, including the people enforcing it, miserable. And let's be honest, 9 times out of 10, in morally authoritarian societies, the people who are tasked with enforcing the moral order the strongest are also the ones who are breaking every rule from Sunday on the side when no one is looking. The priest who is the firebrand against homosexuality is probably also the one stooping the altar boy. The one hardest against drugs probably has a drug problem.
Yes, I agree that also is a problem of humanity. But I have really enjoyed our discussion. But if I were to ever change my mind, I would need a lot of data on the side effects of these purified drugs or in them in their more natural form.
Yeah,
And I
and
would
that's
also
the other
need to
thing.
see.
We will never know if people aren't allowed to experiment with them, and scientists won't be allowed to experiment with a lot of them because it's very difficult to experiment with a Schedule 1 drug because they're technically illegal in most cases.
Also, I would need to see the long term effects because, while it may seem like it would be okay to laboratory condition, like as we know, life is not a laboratory.
Yeah,
Like there,
life very much doesn't help with the laboratory condition, but you got to start somewhere. And again, I think generally leaning more towards figuring things out, or at least, or at the very least, understanding why we criminalize them in the first place. Because a lot of the times these drug laws were put in place blanket instead of on a case by case basis. It's not like someone went through with a clipboard and went, okay, this drug seems to be fine, so it's legal. This drug seems to be not fine, so it's illegal.
well, the
It
thing
was
is, I feel
literally
like
a
it would
moral
be a
panic back in the 90s or back in the 50s of like um, drugs in general, capital D in air quotes, drugs in general are the problem. Never mind that, pharmaceuticals are drugs, but, oh well, cognitive dissonance doesn't
thing is,
countenance
I
these
feel like it
things
would
very
be
well.
extremely difficult to do that because, like as I mentioned, drugs are popping up like like something that you had never heard of or even considered to be
Yeah,
a
they're
dangerous
spreading like
substance.
wildfire very often, but
Yeah, and like
yet
people are creating new ones, like something that you have never heard of and have no idea what it is. It could spread like wildfire before you even realize that it's a major problem.
and what would happen, for example, if drugs existed in a white market, and instead of those people whiling away in their basements or whatever to create these new drugs, what if some pharmaceutical company or something was like, hey, that seems like an interesting new drug you have there. You want to come, you want us to give you a job so you can come test it in a laboratory so we can see what the effects of it are, because that would also create jobs. And that's the other thing about these the idea of legalizing, taxing, regulating all or at least the majority of drugs, or at least doing it on a case by case basis, is much as with the transition of weed from a black market to a white market. Not only is it just generally a good thing for society, but it also created a fuck ton of jobs that wouldn't have been viable ahead of time, and it turned otherwise criminal individuals into semi-upstanding members of society, which seems like a good, step in the direction for me. All things considered.
Yeah, but
Because how many people become criminals not because they want to do bad things, but because they find that their only skill, or the only skill they have developed up until this point, is selling a particular drug that happens to be illegal. Well, now they have to engage with the criminal element because that's just how the cookie crumbled. Whereas in a case where you had uh, psilocybin dispensaries like you have weed dispensaries, they could go and just start a business, get a job, and then become functional member of society. Yay, win-win.
well, for that, I would argue that if someone is good at selling drugs, their talent isn't selling drugs. Their talent is selling things, and like the thing that you sell doesn't necessarily have to be an illegal substance.
I mean maybe not, but it's it's sort of an academic point when you consider that if that's the option life presents you with, then especially if you happen to be in a shitty situation, you're probably you're probably going to take it. Whereas again, in the hypothetical where there are other drug dispensaries similar to like we have with weed, they go, "Oh, I'm really good at selling this particular thing. I'm going to start a business selling this particular thing and create a dispensary, and I'm going to get my license and I'm going to do it properly." Whereas, if there is no proper, if there is no chain of propriety where you can go from salesman to business owner to dispensary to whatever, then they're just going to wind up getting further and further radicalized into the criminal element, and then they become too far gone at some point where uh, even if they could be offered to sell other things, they're like, nah, I've been selling, LSD for 20 years. I'm not going to stop now. And
Ed Brewer brought up a question: how do cartels react to legal drugs? Well, my theory is that we'll basically try to invent something new and powerful, so that people could offer, like, hey, that drug you got, it's legal, but it won't get you nearly as high as this stuff we got over here.
I mean maybe, but then that just becomes a back and forth of we legalize and refine it, and then they come up with something new, and then we legalize and refine it, and then they come up with it. Like, generally speaking, what happens when cartels are catch wind of things about to be decriminalized or legalized, they freak the fuck out because, as with the mafia and prohibition, they realize that 90% of their business model comes from it being unnecessarily illegal, which leads to this really hilarious situation where the two biggest proponents of keeping certain drugs illegal are big pharma because they don't want the competition and or they want to bleed the consumer dry, or the drug cartels because they know as long as these substances are illegal, they will continue to make bank. Whereas if they're turned into a white market, then they might actually have to get real people jobs, and they wouldn't be drug kingpins anymore.
But like I said, they'd probably just find a way around that. And you mentioned before the legalizing and refine it. My question is, how many lives would be destroyed in that interim of the drug being introduced and the drug being
Well,
refined
how
and
many how
legalized?
many how many lives are being destroyed in the interim of decriminalizing or legalizing a bunch of shit? I would argue they're relatively similar numbers, and only some of the drug cartels are going to be that clever. Most of them probably are just going to go, oh, I can do the same job but from a clean dispensary now, and all I have to do is get certification. Cool. It's only going to be the people who were probably too far gone to be reasoned with to begin with that wind up staying and incentivizing the creation of a new thing. And even then, only some of those people are going to be clever enough to keep innovating. So it's one way or the other. It's going to be a much smaller to the point of almost irrelevancy problem. Whereas if the shadows remain unaltered, it's going to become more and more gang heavy. It's going to become more and more cartel heavy, and it's going to become more and more governmental bureaucracy and big pharma heavy. And I'm sorry, but no singular drug baron can do the amount of damage the combined incompetence of the U.S. government and the machinations of big pharma have done since the beginning of the drug war.
You know, I'm a programmer, and when designing user interface, there's something we do called quality assurance, basically testing out the interface in order to make it idiot proof,
Yeah,
because we have a saying that if a user can find a way to break a program, they will break the program.
but yeah,
But
mods are a cottage industry in video games. There's nothing else, so that's a good example.
but here's the thing: like, if we were to allow people access to these drugs, what's to stop them from being like absolute morons with it? And like say
Well,
even or and even not necessarily the customers, but the dispensaries themselves, what's to stop them from, say, trying to enhance the quality of the high of the product by, say, mixing in with something else that would make it more dangerous, but make it, a better high?
well, the same is true of weed dispensaries and every other kind of illicit substance. It if your argument is we can't do this because some people will be morons, then that literally undermines literally everything human beings have ever done correct to advance their society. Because no matter how well you design a system, some people, some humans will be humans and will find a way to be morons with it.
No, but
You
my
know,
thing
you,
is, right
you can
now
be.
it's already
Go
illegal.
ahead.
I'm saying if we want to legalize it, we should like there should be some method of ensuring safety and
Yeah,
quality
but
of the.
the problem is I look at the situation now and I see so much collateral, so much unnecessary idiocy and unnecessary collateral damage comes from it being illegalized because it services the cartels and big pharma, that if we legalize it, the only thing we have to deal with at that point is the same factor of people being stupid that we've always had to deal with. It's the same is true of booze, it's true of weed, it's true of literally anything that brings a certain percentage of people joy. Some people get overly addicted to and will take to unhealthy degrees. I mean, we just got through talking about sugar. Imagine a universe where people were like, we can't legalize refined sugar because some people will become obese with it. Well,
I
that
don't.
may be.
I mean, should we have legalized that?
I mean, again, I will always lean more libertarian. I think for the sake of everyone else whose lives will be made better with refined sugar, we shouldn't we shouldn't criminalize it or illegalize it just because some people will overindulge. There will always be people who overindulge. There will always be morons. There will always be people who try to game the system. But making everyone else's lives miserable, including your own, just to prevent other people from being morons is not and has never been a sustainable way of running a civilization. My stance is we should screw the bureaucracies, screw the cartels, screw the big pharma, and make everyone's lives better, and then let the idiots bear the consequences of their own idiocy as with everything else, rather than fighting everyone else's joy and everyone else's possible improvement of quality of life just to prevent some people being idiots. Because if that's the approach we take, if we take the approach of some people will be idiots with this, therefore we have to spite everyone else who will use it responsibly and enjoy it properly and gain quality of life from it, then we're going to have to go back to the fucking Stone Age, because literally everything that humans have ever discovered has been used by a certain proportion of idiots who take advantage of it. But that doesn't
Well, here's the
mean
thing.
that
In my
everyone
opinion,
else isn't uh, everyone else's quality of life isn't radically improved by it being available and being reasonably attainable.
here's the thing. From my perspective, I don't. On the whole, I don't believe that the quality of life will necessarily improve. I'm willing to acknowledge that there are some people who would be helped by it, but I don't think that society would be better off if we legalized it.
I think we would, and honestly, society to me isn't even the issue. I'm talking about people in general. I think, it, generally speaking, becoming
Well,
more
when I say
libertarian.
society, I mean people.
Yeah, but well, there is a bit of a distinction. But in general, my understanding of history is every time we discover a new way to make people's lives easier or better or more enjoyable, it becoming widespread and being treated with libertarian approaches is always better in the long run than being moralistic and authoritarian about it. Now, there's a gray area where I'm not advocating for civilization all of a sudden to be Ancapistan, mind you, but um, if we treat most drugs like we treat weed and like we treat booze, most people are going to, you know, it's going to be a novelty for a little bit, and then it's going to be another possible pastime for them to engage in, and then civilization will be made better by whatever it can be made better by in that thing. There might be some more idiots who find a new way to be idiots, but if we don't give them drugs to be stupid with, they'll just find Tide Pods or motorcycles or roofs or their own bodies sometimes. Like the lowest common denominator of humanity will always exist to Darwin award themselves out of existence. But that doesn't mean that everyone else should live in, a Stepford Wives version of the future, or a San Angeles version of the future, just because we got it in our heads that we can't let the idiots have this, because the idiots will be idiots with it. The idiots will be idiots with everything. Let everyone else have access to the thing. And the idiots will Darwin Award win themselves out of the gene pool sooner or later, and then we'll all be better for it. And if nothing else, it will at least make the idiot does something stupid compilations better and more numerous.
Well, we've gone on for nearly an hour and a half, so I think it's a good time to wrap up.
Yeah.
This was a good discussion. I don't think either of our minds were really changed, but honestly, this is
No,
why I wanted to do this.
I don't think so. But I mean, the show is called The Duality of Man for a reason, because we're kind of supposed to exemplify the different sides of issues when stuff like this happens, and I think we've done a pretty serviceable job displaying the two approaches that you could take with this particular issue.
And that's why I wanted to do this podcast with you, so we could discuss these types of issues in a reasonable and respectful manner.
Yeah, because I mean, it's not like either of us is going to get butthurt or angry about this disagreement. It's just a thing we disagree on, and the world keeps spinning.
Yeah.
And time will tell which, if any, of our approaches, or possibly neither of them, because there is also the establishment will keep being stupid approach, where neither of these reasonable options will be taken, because there is always someone will just hit the stupid button and avoid any intelligent discussion. But who knows?
I mean, that's the more likely outcome.
Unfortunately, yeah, the drug war will keep drug warring, and neither the more restrictive but beneficial approaches will be taken, or the more libertarian or beneficial approaches will be taken. It would just be incompetent bureaucracy layered on top of more incompetent bureaucracy, and the world will keep spinning for another 20 years until eventually civilization collapses, and then one or both of us will try our respective hands at rebuilding it.
Provided we're even around.
Yeah, I'm assuming we survive the apocalypses, because I'm conniving enough to survive, and you're capable enough to survive. So between the two of us, I think we'll be fine.
All right, I've been Mr. E.
I have been Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator, and this has been a very divisive Duality of Man.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers.